Hello, beautiful community. This is a long-form question and answer session. I predicted it's going to take me about an hour to answer all of the questions. Half of them come from Patreon, and I'll say later on what that platform means in this conversation I'm having with the culture. The rest come from YouTube comments. I'm not here to tell you what to feel. I'm not even quite here to tell you what to think, but I am here to explore with you what it is you think and what you might yet think that you don't, and how to make sense of the things that you feel. So Grace has her first question, and if Grace doesn't mind, I'm going to retranslate the question into why the hell didn't we do anything, or didn't we do more in 2014 when Mr. Putin started his war against Ukraine and annexed Crimea? And I think, Grace, the answer is probably in different directions. Let me mention a couple of them. One is maskirovka, and you heard that bit of the answer because I talked about it on the live stream the other day, I think, and you may have been there. Hybrid war, maskirovka is a Russian word for making something look like it isn't the thing that it is. And hybrid war is extremely difficult to impart on a democratic citizenship as a real thing. Because you tell your citizens, hey guys, there's a war going on, it affects our national interests, it's not right on our border, but it's in Europe. Let's take it seriously. But then your citizens look and they see something that is maybe a war, but maybe isn't. And it looks like it is, according to some people, but according to others, it isn't. And some other people are saying it's a civil war. And I mean, yes, some people have fallen out of the sky and been killed from Western Europe. But at the same time, it doesn't look like a standard war. So it's very difficult because if citizens look on the internet, on television, in the papers, it doesn't clearly look like a war. This is a very, very hard sell. And that's why, even though it's backfiring on him profoundly, there was a lot that was very effective and skillful in the way Putin confiscated Crimea. There's no doubt about that. And then there are a couple of other directions. I mean, I don't need to say this. That doesn't mean it's good. I mean, you can assess political efficacy without, completely tying that to approval or disapproval. But then there are a couple of other lanes here that make it difficult for us to recognize that was a war in 2014. I think one is the sense that, so this is now another thread. One is the sense that wars don't happen in Europe. And I've been probably because of my health not in as many rooms as I would like, but I've been in many rooms where professional academics have said, and these are IR experts, these are historians, that there hasn't been a war in Europe since the Second World War. That wars don't really happen in Europe anymore. And that's an extraordinary thing to hear, because what about the Balkans? You've just written out of your European map this part of it on which occurred a bloodbath in the 1990s. So, yes, there are no wars in Europe, minus the place where there were awful wars and ethnic cleansing. Okay, so that prejudice persists, and so whatever it is, it can't be the full thing. It can't be serious enough because that sort of thing doesn't happen in Europe. And then I think there is a second way in which it's hard for us to read these things. And that's the kind of prejudice that says that progressively we're moving toward peace. And that's because once you get the economics right, the right sort of politics follows, and violence diminishes, wars diminish, somebody in our culture with a very fluffy haircut has been writing about how there is progressively less violence. And so these are illusions, and we are under them to some extent. And I think that was another part of it, that we were moving into a globalized world where conflict was going to diminish. So I think these are some of the things that made it hard for us to recognize it, and also for us to put pressure on our elites about it. But there's so much more to say. I hope that's enough of a sketch. Our next question comes from Tacitus, and it's about how easily we go fascist. I'd be interested in your thought on the third wave experiment. How much can we learn from it about fascism? Is it really as applicable as people say? But the most important thing is, what could the students have done in this situation to stop the experiment before the teacher had to intervene? So I'm not going to say much about the third wave experiment because I don't know much about it, but roughly, kids ask their teacher, is it true that we'd all go fascist if the right conditions obtained or the wrong conditions obtained? And the teacher conducted a social experiment on them, persuading they were part of a fictional global social movement, and over the course of a few days they engaged in rather unlovely social practices and rituals within the school with a fascist twang, and then they were told that this was just a practical joke, an experiment. So I don't know what takeaway you have in mind exactly, but I'm guessing it's just the idea that a large number of people, just when certain conditions obtain, would just go fascist. And I think I want to probably say two things in two different directions about this. One is just a bit about the rise of, above all, Nazism in the middle of the 20th century in Europe, and the other just directly about how easily we'd go fascist. For decades now, our children have been getting very banal explanations of what actually happened in the 20s and 30s in Germany. And just imagine a class of 16-year-olds, this has happened all over the world, staring at a graph with rising unemployment on one side and rising Nazi vote on the other. And the economy matters a lot, but our conventional explanations of that period are overly economically deterministic. And so when that runs out, people then say, well, yes, it's not just the economy, it's also just maybe German culture. So being unemployed and poor and German causes Nazism? Well, it was also the romantic European value of national self-realization. And of course, romantic capital R values are a huge part of our culture. Authenticity is probably the most important value in our culture, even though it's mostly expressed in a distorted consumerist form. But it doesn't make the thing not real, it just means that most of our social practices around it are distortions of it. So that's just a European thing. So being poor, German, and European causes Nazism? Well, also, they were very prejudiced against minority groups. So what does that mean? What do you mean prejudiced? They just had false beliefs about Jews and others, really. So having false beliefs about Jews being European and German and poor causes Nazism. So I'm being facetious, but because in fact there are grains of truth to all the things we've mentioned, significant grains of truth. But what I'm saying is that this conversation is normally represented in banalities, whereas in fact, working this out has to be a process in time. Not in the sense that it takes a long time to understand why the Nazis came to power and why that was possible, but in the sense that that process of understanding never ends. These are questions that we have to ask and re-ask and re-ask, and there is no terminus here. There is no pie chart you're going to arrive at that gives you a breakdown of explanation. And of course, part of the explanatory story is going to be social explanation, various social forces, economic forces, forces of modernity working. One. Two, it's going to be cultural, historical explanation, certainly, and there's going to be psychological explanation. But this is not a banality. That's one general comment. And then about how easily we go fascist specifically. Well, take the United States now. It's a democracy that is more prone to illusion on balance than any other Western democracy, but it's a functioning democracy. It's an extraordinary culture. And we talk about it a lot because it is now protecting Ukraine from Russian imperialism more than any other actor. Now, all major political movements in the United States have a great deal of illusion to them. That's true of the centrist Democrat movement, roughly sort of Hillary Clinton, if you think in terms of the last quarter century. That's also true of the democratic socialism movement, Bernie. That's true of the centrist Republican movement. It's in some ways perhaps more true of Trumpism because it's a more toxically, democratically degenerative movement. But let's just take the United States and take the example of Trumpism, even though it's certainly not the only political movement that is beset by illusion. Illusion, by the way, roughly is when you think that certain things are possible that are completely impossible, and delusion, correcting myself here, and delusion is when you think that things are true about the world today that aren't. So that's to say, being under illusion is misunderstanding what the world could be, and being under a delusion is misunderstanding what the world is. So I should have said delusion there. So let's just pick on Trumpism and say that there's a bunch of people who believe that Trump won the 2020 election. Now, there's no truth to this, and this is a deranged belief. You shouldn't be condescending to people who believe it, because that belief is not just an error. It's produced by various social forces that make it understandable and make the loss of trust it is a product of understandable. We'll talk about that. But what I'm saying is, take this and then add some extra hypotheticals which don't obtain. Imagine that Trump isn't Trump, that Trump is John Smith. And then he comes to power. And having come to power, he ends free elections. So he cannot get removed from office via election. He ends any independence for the courts. That doesn't mean the courts get politicized, worrying. It means that the work of the courts ends. That any time you go to the courts, they give you a political answer, right? That serves the interests of John Smith. John Smith controls all major media, from Fox to Washington Post to CNN to the New York Times. And John Smith is on a mission to liberate out of you all kinds of destructive and resentful energies. And John Smith is on a mission to persuade you that Mexico is an existential threat to the United States, and that Mexico is trying to disappear the United States as a political entity with the help of malign Chinese and Russian influence. And imagine that this lasts not for 1, not for 5, not for 10, but for 20 years. How many people would there be in the United States with utterly deranged political views? An enormous number, an absolutely enormous number. And imagine it also became illegal in public to criticize the government, or at least illegal in many contexts. So would that, to a great extent, break in a way that is radically worse to anything you see now, the way an American citizen makes sense of her politics. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So this needs a much longer conversation, but is it tendentiously true that only a minority of people, if the right conditions obtain, still keep clear in their head that up is up, that down is down, that the sky is blue? Yeah, it is true. It is true that you should expect, all things being equal, only a minority to stand like that. But there is enormous variation between societies here, and there will be variation according to different economic factors, different cultural factors. But is it generally true that only a minority will stand with the clear understanding that up is up and down is down? It roughly is. So if that's the question you're asking, the answer is yep. Our next question comes from Dan Barr, and I'm going to blend it together with a question from AC because they're quite similar. And it's a bit of a lottery here how long I'm going to spend on each question, but I've spent so much on the first two that I'm going to, for some at least, just hurry up quite a bit. Vlad, how Western is Russia? To what extent do humanist, pacifist, or human rights sensibilities operate in Russian culture and society? And to what extent is the glorification of violence and imperial conquest prevalent? I don't think that you can contrast Western values with glorification of violence and imperial conquest. And I don't think that it's clear that human rights are Western values. We can talk about that, and we will at length. I'm planning a human rights lecture actually on the Philosophy Channel, long form lecture. So here is what I would say. The bit about Russian culture that is exclusively, that is entirely Western, is Russian high culture. All Russian literature, virtually all Russian literature, virtually all Russian art music is Western, right? So whether you think Rachmaninoff is a great composer or a crap composer or a pop composer, Rachmaninoff is a European composer. Yeah. Rachmaninoff is on a tree, right? That Haydn and Mozart are on. It's the same tree. It's just a branch on it. It's an evolution, several evolutions down the line from, the classical musical language, which certainly Rachmaninoff doesn't practice, of Haydn, Schubert, Beethoven, and Mozart. Same with Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is a branch on a tree called European literature. So Russian high art is completely European. And because I'm trying to be brief, can you say that about the rest of Russian culture? No. But then an interesting question arises. What resources are available to Russia that are political resources except European political ideas and conceptions? And my answer tends to be that as Russia reaches for a political conversation with itself, it doesn't have much to reach for except European resources. So this is a bit elliptical, but this is all that I'm going to say for now. Well, perhaps one more thing. The glorification of violence and imperial conquest, isn't absent from 20th century European history. So part of what we're seeing is just what happens when an empire is in a very destructive way collapsing. So none of this is an answer, but this is a gesture in several directions. And here AC's question is a compliment. And it's about how much less is an individual life worth in Russia? Is a Russian life, is a Western life worth 2 or 3 Russian lives? If you compare, basically, this is the question. If you compare how a Western citizen, a French person, would look upon what it means for a fellow citizen to just lose their life versus what it means for a Russian citizen to think about their fellow citizen losing their life. I've summarized that question. I think the really important thing is to not start thinking of it that way around. You have to start thinking of it first personally. That quite certainly in contemporary Russian culture, outside of young urban folks who do think of their lives like Europeans, but in Russian culture, generally, the value is less, but it starts with you. My life is worth less. And hence, I am going to do various kinds of reckless things. I'm going to put my life on the line, go kill some Ukrainians, and maybe that'll help me alleviate these vast debts that I'm in. So yes, the value of an individual life is much less in Russian culture compared to European cultures. And this starts with you. So you're not just sitting there thinking, well, it's okay if Harry and Barry next door disappear. You actually say that about yourself too. So there's this kind of fatalistic recklessness about escalating risks to one's own life in a way that'd be unimaginable to us. Our next question is from Marianne, and she asks, it baffles people in the West how Russians seem to accept all the lies they're told. There are 2 words in Russian for the word lie, Vranyo and lozh, as well as 2 words for truth, istina and pravda. Could you tell us a bit more about this phenomenon, what it means? Well, I can tell you more about the words. So take lozh as being just falsehood. And Vranyo is different. Vranyo is falsehood expressed in a social practice. Vranyo is a particular kind of social practice which goes more with lying as misdemeanor rather than lying as crime. So it implies either, and these are opposite things, or at least very different things, either trivial lying or the triviality of lying, right? Thinking of even big lies as a trivial thing for humans to do. So that's that difference, or at least the beginning of a talk about it. And the other one is istina and pravda. Pravda is just truth. Istina is a deeper kind of truth. I think some people would say it's a transcendental truth. I think that's wrong. Istina can just be a deeper truth or a more fundamental truth, and it doesn't have to be transcendental. So Werner Herzog, in his interviews makes a distinction between the accountant's truth and something that's a deeper truth. He calls it an ecstatic truth. But however you wanted to chop this up, istina is about the truth that really matters to a human being living a purposive life. That's what I would say. It doesn't have to have a semblance of transcendence. Was this helpful? Next question comes from Frank, and Frank says, this may be odd, but there's so much talk about 41 to 45 and how that influences Russian culture. But what about 1812? I'm assuming its mythological effect has been rather overtaken by the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, but I'm still curious whether you see a role for it. Yeah, I do. So one of the biggest myths in Russian culture is expressed both in the Second World War and in 1812 with the burning of Moscow. And that is Russia ending up winning from an almost hopeless losing position. So that's expressed not just in a mythology about how a war might go, but how a country's destiny on the world stage might go. You see, part of this entire self-immolating imperialistic outburst by Mr. Putin is the idea that Russia has to start, at the back, the economy that competes with only a tiny European country, and then somehow, via a series of extravagant zigzags, propel itself to the forefront of nations in terms of political and military esteem and power. So that's a huge myth. I think 1812 is still a big part of it. Something else I would say, actually. The Napoleonic War is more talked about in Russia than it is in Western conversations about Russian history. So actually, even though we don't talk about it as much when we talk about Russian myths, Russians do talk about it quite a lot. Our next question is from David. And David asks, how much does overworking and other class-based hardships affect depoliticization? From my personal experience, I feel as if I see many people who offload their politics simply because they're too tired to have bigger problems on their hands to engage politically. I think, David, this requires a little bit more social science and anthropology than we can quite ask from a moral, political philosopher. Let me just put a couple of things on the table. First of all, structural disadvantage is real. And successful Americans with integrity often underestimate the role of structural disadvantage via this sort of nauseatingly optimistic aspirational psychology that often has a good chance of explaining things at an individual level, at least part of the way, but is rather hopeless at explaining societal patterns. So to take a relatively trivial example, can you be poor in Britain or in the United States and eat well? If you theoretically showed that it's possible, for me that wouldn't really show that it's possible. So for example, if you're in Britain, I can tell you how to, let's say you're not a vegan for ethical reasons and for climate reasons. So I could tell you how to eat very cheaply if you wanted to eat meat. I'd say eat game and wild birds. You can get a very small wild bird, like a wild pigeon, for about £2.50. Can you get it in a supermarket? No. But if you know what's what, you can easily order yourself. And if you're not eating too much and you're having a lot of nice, simple, cheap vegetables, you can have a little bird per person with nice vegetables, and that's a nice meal. You can eat animal organs from biodynamic farms because people tend to not want that. I could give you 20, 30 other hacks. Are they available in the sense that they would constitute meals not necessarily more expensive than meals people might have? Yeah. But are they quite accessible? Well, no, because it requires time, energy, and maybe even networking to understand how that's available and to get it. I mean, you could bake yourself bread at home. You could just make it from linseed and water. It'd be a bit weird tasting, but that'd work. That'd cost you about, I don't know, 40p per loaf. You can do it. But I think, that kind of extraordinary menu of cheap food items is the sort of thing Gwyneth Paltrow would put together for you. I would say it's not really available, right? And if you understand this advantage properly, you understand it's not available. Second thought, I don't think poverty is linked to a lack of political participation in itself. At least that's not the connection that we should find interesting. I think that poverty in a society in which poverty doesn't come with community could be linked with political apathy. And poverty linked with the sense that there is no political lever available to pull that could in any way inflect the way your politics is going for whatever reason, because there are these global forces out there, because your government's betraying you, because your politics is no longer making sense. So that sense of inflection and leverage being absent, which has happened since the early 70s little by little and is at an extreme level now, that's a problem. But I don't think that in of itself being busy and overburdened and poor gets you to political depoliticization. These are just general thoughts, and for specific causal connections, we should look to social science while also questioning the capacity of the social sciences to make these generalizations. Often the generalizations the social sciences give us are methodologically bogus. Our next question is an emotional question from Ahmad, and the question is a page long, so I'm going to read just 2 or 3 sentences. My question is, what is wrong with one if one can't hear children screaming? There are wars. There are things we do, from Hiroshima to Dresden to Vietnam, and we are better than some of the others. We put a higher value on human life. People are just mean, or at best profit from others inflicting pain and suffering. My very first memories are of this meanness. It seems to be the default setting for our species. Maybe I should have a thicker skin. Maybe I should care less about this. I don't know what to do. The closest I've come to a solution is the idea that the suffering and death that happens shouldn't be in vain. Look, it's an important question. At what point your reaction stops being compassion and becomes something that you need therapy for? But let me say, and it's important to not under-pathologize one's reaction to the world, but it's also important to not over-pathologize it. That's a real balance. So just a couple of quick images that are not going to help much. One is that, there's a real sense of the absurd to the kind of politics that we talk about on this channel. It's completely absurd. We're talking about people sitting around in ties with expensive watches, figuring out alliances and plans and signing bits of paper and making calls. And then as a result of this, one afternoon, we'll say Ukraine because we're focusing on Ukraine, children get blown out of their apartment block. And then these people keep shuffling paper and keep making decisions and keep making calls. And more children are blown out of other apartment blocks. The incongruity of this is kind of absurd. And it's very important to recognize the special absurdity of human relations when they're mediated by the institutions we share. That's one thought. Let me just share one second thought. Unfortunately, it's a part of human life that good things are predicated on bad things, and that we don't have ways of transcending that altogether. A classic example of this in history is ancient Greek slavery. Because one feature of the ancient world that's very important to understand is that they didn't think that slavery was good. They thought it was necessary. There's one man, one of the 5 greatest moral philosophers who ever lived, Aristotle, who did try to justify slavery. But that was very conservative and bogus, even by the standards of his own culture. And he behaved differently in his own private life, liberated his slaves in his will. But they thought that any kind of civilization to be sustainable has to have the institution of slavery. A cruel institution, an institution that it is bad luck to fall into, but it's necessary. So, their account of slavery was very different to their account of women, right? Because women needed to be very roughly in the kitchen for the ancient Greeks. But they needed to be in the kitchen because they had an absence of proper deliberative capacities that men had. So they had a prejudice about women that we don't share in the modern world because it's false. But they didn't think that about slaves. They didn't think there were people suited to being slaves, like they thought women were suited to being in the kitchen. They thought that anybody who was a slave was unlucky to be a slave, but that unless some people were slaves, the society couldn't function. And many writers and thinkers historically have been very concerned with this business of how good things come from bad things and how good things depend on bad things. And, I do think it's fair to say that a lot of the marvelous quality of life that many humans experience is not unconnected with other human beings in other parts of the world being in a nightmare. And that we don't even have solutions to this. So that's my second comment. I haven't helped, but I've put a couple of things on the table. Go gently. John, you are next, and you're asking a question about the judicial system in Russia. Someone needs to talk about the judicial system in Russia. Putin does not sit next to each judge and jury and point to the accused and shout, "Guilty." Does the judge automatically side with the prosecution? Is evidence of no concern to a case? A prosecutor says she had a blank piece of A4 in her hands. She's clearly against the Russian military operation. How can this be fixed? So this is an interesting question. With the biggest political prisoners, it is Mr. Putin. So everything that happens to Mr. Navalny is really curated by Mr. Putin. Any sentence Navalny might get, any reprieve Navalny might get, any extension Navalny might get. And I'd even argue the balance of the torture practices Navalny experiences is roughly set according to what Putin has indicated. And I think that's probably true with a couple of other political prisoners. Might be true about Karamurza, that Mr. Putin says 25 years looks nice. In another case, you might say 15 years looks nice. So they're couriered by Putin in a small number of cases. In the rest of it, if it's a political case, the state wins. You're talking about does the judge automatically side with the prosecution? Well, if the case is brought by the FSB, for example, or if evidence is brought by the FSB, it is just accepted, even if it looks incoherent and bizarre. So, for example, Mr. Roizman, who's an ex-mayor of Yekaterinburg and is in legal trouble, obviously, since the beginning of the war, but he's so inordinately popular in his city that it may or may not be hard for them to put him away the way they've put away Karamurza. We're going to just see what happens. But he hasn't even done anything wrong by the standards of the draconian Russian laws. They've literally just made something up. They've said he did something on a social media account that he never had, or he never had access to. What do we say about that? There's a piece of evidence, right, that's brought by the state in a political case, and even though it's demonstrably false, it's going to be accepted by any judge. What do we do about this? I think this is the easiest thing to fix, John. There is no such thing as getting the political process going. Okay, Mr. Putin is gone. Okay, Russia now gets to press a button, a political process gets going. But actually, one of the very few things that can sort of get going fairly easily are the courts. Because once you unobstruct them and you just take away the political influence, they will start working 10 times better. So an independent judiciary is actually a lot easier to fix, or at least fix part of the way, by omission of action. So that's a couple of words. Our next question is from Luka, and Luka is saying, you mentioned showing a future path to Russians, and I talk about a path where there is a perception of an alternative to Putin that is also actionable. What would you think about spreading the word about nonviolent resistance to dissidents and the general population? Well, the Russian opposition have to politicize that depoliticized blob in the middle, so that part of it at least joins the folks who are genuinely oppositional to Putin, oppositional to the war already. So these are 20% of the population, and then some bit of that 50-60% that's depoliticized can be siphoned off to join those, and on it goes. And the point for the Russian opposition is to contribute to a situation where the majority of that depoliticized blob tilts, if you like, toward the democratic republic, away from authoritarian imperialism. And the only way that's going to happen is if it becomes absolutely clear that Russia must have decentralization and federalization, and that has got to be not a sort of abstract aspiration, but something that people concretely feel. They concretely feel that the absence of this federalization is intolerable. Russia's extraordinarily hierarchical way of going on. and that there's a way of doing this better. So this is an important job for the Russian opposition. How can Russians even begin to reshape their politics? You say, if we ourselves are struggling with it, and even for us, this is too big a stone to keep pushing uphill. The hill may likely generate an avalanche or mudslide anyway. Yeah, in the West, in the next 10, 20 years, a few democracies, I would predict, will experience a really disturbing mudslide, the way Hungary has experienced it. Now, that doesn't mean that other countries can't travel in the opposite direction toward a positive democratic progression, but it does nevertheless mean that we live in a world where there are some global forces, acting against any country that wants to be a democracy, and about those we'll talk more. But whenever there is conversation about spreading the word to Russians, it's really important to not be under the misapprehension that they need to be informed about things. They don't need to be informed about anything. They need to be politicized. And that's a difference. Our next question is from Chris, and I might end up repeating myself a bit in answer to it, I imagine. You've been talking about the slide that our Western democracies are in, and I would add, I feel there is even an uncomfortable veering towards fascism. We want to be sort of, clear or clearly unclear about what we mean by fascism. There's also a lot of talk about soft fascism, and that's a term that may be useful too. My question: what do you think is the root of this global trend, and what is its logical next development and timing? There are social forces that are part and parcel of this trend, which is to say that the main thing you hear about the decline of democracy in the West, we have to apply moral willpower, we have to get our act together. Look, the Ukrainians are fighting for it, why can't we, recall that these are our values and we mustn't undermine them from within. All of these siren songs are of value, but it's a mistake to think that they touch the source of the problem. The source of the problem is, if you want an image for it, on top of this regular metaphor I give of how democracies are exiting the bay and they're going to be out in open water, which doesn't mean they're going to sink because they're not river-going vessels. They can take a storm. But another image is just our society's untethering, such that it comes about that there isn't enough holding them together to sustain the kind of trust that is a precondition of democratic polity. Some of these are forces of economic untethering, various global forces, various policies of deregulation. Some of these things are to do with the state of the internet and the disinhibiting and atomizing effect of the internet, the way it puts us into these things that are sometimes called echo chambers, helpfully or unhelpfully. And so that's a list that we would continue. So it's not just a moral failing. There are a set of forces acting upon us. And consequently, something that is absolutely essential to the sustenance of democratic life, which is the feeling that we're all in this together, we're all citizens of one country, and we're all in this together, and we identify with a sense of belonging around, citizenship, around citizen belonging. So that is fragile for us, and it cannot be made firm by anything we do at the level of willpower, right? Now, there are ways to slow this process down. We'll talk about them. There's various patterns of democratic regeneration to counter the democratic degeneration. But basically, we're facing the biggest crisis of democratic trust since the middle of the 19th century, probably. Since in Europe, it's certainly since the middle of the 19th century, since 1848, since the revolutions of 1848. And it's not solvable. We cannot solve it. So we can slow down the decline by doing quite a few things that are constructive. We'll talk about that too. But because this is produced by social forces and not just by a bad run, the direction is down. And that is why the naive view, democracies go up and down, they come and go, is an elementary misunderstanding, not just of where we are, but how one begins to explain what is possible, right? So if you think, well, democracy can have a bad decade, then it'll have a good decade, you're not understanding democratic capacity. You're not understanding how to evaluate what democracy is capable of in a given historical period. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but it doesn't just ebb and flow the way most people think. And it's in this that you often see this mistake of thinking that manifestations in society that people don't like are aberrations, beyond which we'll eventually revert to the good stuff. But that doesn't mean you lose hope, and it doesn't mean there isn't going to be progress. But it means that the trend is in the wrong direction, and it's a fantasy to think that there's any way to bring the boat back into the bay. The bay is done. The question is, who's going to stay afloat? And my prediction is that some Western democracies will simply sink in the next couple of decades, and a majority will wonkily stay afloat, but it's not going to be a majority of 95% in all likelihood. So our next question is from Jill, and Jill is saying, if the super important thing is that the West and NATO keep strong support for Ukraine, it's not the super important thing, but it is one of the super important things, I would argue. Because this is actually an existential battle for what we call democracy. What is my job? Is it calling Chuck Schumer and expressing my support for continued support for Ukraine? So I don't think support for Ukraine is just about values, because Mr. Putin is threatening the West. Mr. Putin wants to challenge Article 5. So Mr. Putin threatens our security, I would say. So this is not just about, do you believe in democracy and do you want all European countries that want to be a democracy to be allowed to be a democracy? I'm saying that because our support for Ukraine is not primarily, in my estimation, humanitarian. And it's not primarily value-based, actually. It's to push back a convulsively self-immolating empire that endangers the world. The best thing you can do, and it might be that your vote is irrelevant from this point of view, depending on which part of the country you're in, but the best thing you can do for this, and pretty much for anything else that matters, is to make sure the democratic game is not broken. That's to say, to make sure that in the United States, you can vote the president out. That in the United States, you can vote people out of elected offices. And that no president comes to power, consolidates an elite around them, right? And brings it about that you've got a government you can't get out of office. So watch out for candidates who want to break the democratic game. And also watch out for candidates who have a high chance of inadvertently breaking the democratic game, for instance. And the democratic game is not some kind of ideological idea. It's literally, do the institutions in a very minimal way still work, and can they act as checks upon another? And what you're often going to face is a situation where there is a political candidate who is clearly going to break the democratic game, at least at the level of intent, but he and his supporters say that that's not the case. So what do you do then? And you can do one of two things. You can spend time wondering how it is that this has come about, which is what my channel is largely for. Especially, that'll become especially clear as we talk more about Western democracies. What is it that happened at the time of Obama or at the time of Hillary that made Trump more likely, right? And did anything like that happen, or are these inevitable forces and so on? Or you can say no and say, even if I am somehow part of bringing this about, or some of my own politics is part of bringing this about, it's possible, I'm still going to stand up and say no first, and then I'm going to reflect on how it is that we've got here. But these are the two things you go to, and the priority between them is really important, right? And what you want to do is probably first say no, and then reflect on how we've got into this mess. So you're basically watching for the democratic game not to be broken. Once it's broken, you're screwed, really, at the level of virtually any global crisis, which requires serious policy. You don't have a functioning democracy, you can't have proper climate policy, for example. So the game should not be broken, and that's a priority. Next question is from Stephen, and he's asking, I have a question about why the Red Army gets such admiration from the populace when anyone who served must have experienced a huge level of corruption and incompetence. Is it just an article of faith that's come over from the Red Army of the Great Patriotic War? Do I have the wrong impression? So, institutionally, the army is rather demoted, and that's a feature, not just a bug. So the army is not just a mechanism to engage in various kinds of corruption machinations. It's also the case that the military is kept deliberately weak so that it doesn't become an institution that threatens power. Having said this, if things go particularly south for the Putin regime in this war, then not now, but in the future, you could begin imagining some kind of a military push against the regime. The Z radicals at the moment think the army is utterly inept and pathetic. The depoliticized blob in the middle are just looking away. And those who are against the war understand that the army is a shambles. At the same time, there are these extraordinary myths, and we mentioned one earlier about how Russia comes from behind to the forefront of being a major global power. A myth of how the Russian army, from a losing position, pulls out a victory. So part of the myth about the Russian army is about how it can win from a position of disadvantage and maybe even disorganization and maybe even incompetence. So overcoming problems, overcoming things that are working so badly that they're almost catastrophic, is not necessarily contradiction of the myth of the might of the Russian army. The Russian army is, good at making comebacks from ridiculously unfortunate positions. So that's that. But the key story here is just that what's glorified is the Second World War, not the army. The army is glorified in a way that's secondary to the myth of the Second World War. I think there's another question about that coming up. And that is the single most unifying myth in Russian culture, which is why it's so sick that Mr. Putin has irreversibly ruined it. Now Russians can't even unite about some sense of their fight against the Nazis. So that's what I'd say about that. And now they're training a generation of young children to believe that there's going to be some massive confrontation with the West in years to come, and that the military will be an absolutely culturally central institution. So these are some of my thoughts. I'm happy to say more if it'll help. Our next question is from PK, and PK is asking, I'd love to hear an extended progression of where the electronic conscription leads to on the path to a terror state. It seems that hundreds of thousands of Russian male refugees are on the road to a fork of returning or becoming stateless citizens of nowhere with expired Russian passports. So Russia can't carry on doing what it's doing without progressively taking steps toward becoming a more consolidated totalitarian state, or more consolidated tyranny, however you want to put it. And that's why a lot of people before the war felt that Russia couldn't invade Ukraine, being the kind of state that it was. It couldn't do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and an ongoing war, because that is just not what informational autocracies do. And that was right, actually. Russia immediately had to take a couple of rapid totalitarian turns immediately upon invading. Well, immediately upon invading, and that invasion becoming quite clearly full-scale war, as opposed to what they were hoping for, which is some kind of a blend of a full-scale war and a coup, basically. And these totalitarian turns are going to continue. The passport change, the conscription notice change, really makes it that the onus is on the conscripted person to be aware that they're on the list, rather than what was the case before, when the government needed to send people out to find you and hand you the notice. So now you're just on the list, and that is, whether you know about it or not, that's the equivalent of what before would have been you getting and signing a notice. So if Russia needs a rapid wave of mobilization, perhaps autumn time, this will be now much, much easier. That previous deal, whereby you kept your private freedom but sacrificed your public freedom, is increasingly over. It's most obviously over for those who might be conscripted into the military. The state's going to take possession over their bodies. So I suppose the only comment is this process irreversible so long as the Putin regime is in power? Could the Putin regime create a little thaw, as it were, and just liberalize just a little? No, that's impossible in my assessment, and so it'll have to keep going forward until it snaps. John is asking, when Russians make videos appealing to Putin or other high authorities, are they being sincere, or is this a form of socially accepted protest? Largely both. The aim of the Putin regime was, from the very beginning, to bring it about that there was no room for collective national political action, right? That yes, you could organize, mobilize, protest, but it had to be either about something you want to get rid of locally, or about national policy, but piecemeal. So you could never say, I want to change the government. You could say, I don't like these two policies, I'm protesting about that, and these are the two policies I'd like instead. So now things are changing, and Russia's becoming a much more of a tyranny than it used to be. But certainly up until the beginning of the war, the regime was good at creating avenues for steam to come out by allowing and indeed not being threatened by all kinds of protest, as long as the protest was not against the Putin regime as such. Now, in terms of perception, Mr. Putin still remains the only political institution in the country with perceived legitimacy. So there really are a lot of people who think that the problem isn't him. But then there are people who think that the problem is him, and they can't protest against him. So they either don't protest at all, or they engage in some kind of political activity that is indirectly aimed against the regime without explicitly being so, because if it were now, it's quite certain you'd be in jail. So that's a little bit. Gabe is asking, would you mind describing an example of an acceptable oppositional vision for Belarus? Where would you take them if you were an opposition leader? What sort of ideas could activate them? So I think that's too pessimistic a question, actually, about Belarus, because I think they're pretty much already there. That doesn't mean you can't be critical of the Belarusian opposition, but Tikhanovskaya is the legitimate, democratically elected president of Belarus. So that kind of sense of an alternative, and that sense of the possibility of action toward that alternative is available in Belarus. That got expressed in 2020, right? That is missing in Russia, but it is available in Belarus. So what Russia is aspiring for is what Belarus already has. The trouble that Belarus has got is that it is suffocated by Lukashenko, who is much more an approximation to a leader that's taken the country hostage than Mr. Putin is. Mr. Putin has not quite taken the country hostage the way Lukashenko has. The trouble for Belarus is that Lukashenko has largely taken the country hostage, and Putin has taken Lukashenko hostage. So until you get rid of these two layers, you're in strife. But if you did get rid of these two layers, you'd already see quite a lot of social materials conducive to democracy. Whereas if the Putin regime collapsed tomorrow, if Mr. Putin disappeared tomorrow, and indeed if his elite ran away, that would not be the case in Russia. In Russia, it would be a vacuum, and the country would be asking itself, are we even a country? What holds us together? And so on. Our next question is from Amanda, and Amanda is asking a personal question. Do you listen to music every day? And the answer is yes and no. My health got worse about 2 years ago, and it was already not good before. So the time I work during the day contracted, now to about 2 or 3 hours, which means I'm like a very busy CEO in terms of how I allocate this time. And that means that if I had even 50% of the time a healthy person has, I would absolutely listen to music every day. At the moment, I don't have 50%. I'm more like a 20% of the hours in a day that a healthy person has. And so I listen to music probably every second day, I would say, and not long. But that's the no bit of the answer, but there is a yes part to the answer. And the yes part is that psychologically I'm a musician and a philosopher. So there'll be, in the years to come, work coming up in writing about music, at least, maybe some musicology too. I do have a couple of toes in that discipline. And what I mean when I say that I'm a musician is that if you're not a musician psychologically and you have a relationship with classical music, what you hear in your head is going to be performances of pieces. And the musician doesn't hear performances. They hear the pieces. So every day, every single day without fail, I have about 2 to 10 pieces playing just above my head. But I'm not hearing a particular performance of them. I'm not even hearing an ideal performance of them. What I'm hearing is the shape of the piece before it's realized in sound. So if you take a score by, now most of these things are Schubert, Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach, Haydn, that are in my head. If you take a piece by a great composer, it's absolutely open to a multiplicity of realizations in sound. There isn't just one way you can play a Beethoven sonata. It determines quite a lot about what you can or can't do, but it doesn't determine it to a single performance, single interpretation. But while a lot of musicologists like to talk about the piece under-determining performance, giving you sort of creative freedom as an interpreter, I prefer to say the opposite. I think the piece actually over-determines performance, and the piece can be multiply realized not because it's open, but because it's so contradictorily demanding. It asks you to go up and down, left and right at the same time. And you think, oh my word, how am I going to do that? And so what's in my head is the shape of the piece, really, and the sense of how the piece moves forward with all of its tension, in a way that is short of a performance. And that is going on in my head nearly all the time, unless I'm doing a concrete or particularly busy task. These pieces don't get turned on and off. It's almost like a little sort of lane above your head. It's always there. Next question is from Dom, who's asking, how should the US deal with Trump right now? And what are the lessons that can be learned from Russia's descent into fascism? For instance, should Trump be barred from seeking office on constitutional grounds? So the lesson that we might take from Russia is that there were attempts to obstruct undemocratic political candidates via undemocratic means. So to some extent, the 1996 election in Russia was about saying, oh, wow, the Communist Party is undemocratic. And so we don't want it to get a majority of the votes. So why don't we employ various tricks that are themselves undemocratic to try to stop this undemocratic force? So there's a real danger unless there is a legal case against Trump that is not just extremely compelling, but is seen to be compelling by a big percentage of the population. Unless that's the case, there's a very real danger of harming US democracy by stopping Trump. So the ideal scenario for the United States, if you agree with the assessment, this is the hypothesis the assumption I'm putting on the table, that Trump is an exclusionary, anti-democratic populist. I mean, if you're a Trump voter, you're a bit screwed with obviously, this point. You're going to struggle to absorb it, because that's your candidate. But that's the correct categorization of Trump. Actually, the second to last UK Prime Minister was also a post-truth populist. So, with differences to Trump, but some similarities too. But post-truth and anti-democratic is a feature of both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. But it doesn't mean they break institutions. It means that they would if things went favorably enough for them. And Trump's problem is because of his alleged combination of narcissism. Sorry, I'm blending together a completely legitimate neurodiversity issue and a terrible quality. So I don't mean that they're equivalent, but narcissism can interact in an unlovely way with ADHD, and that's Trump. So that means Trump's really bad at forming elites. So Trump is absolutely an anti-Orban in that sense. He is not going to come to power in 2025 and form an elite around him unless somehow he miraculously gets his act together. He's not capable of that. He's going to remain a one-man show, and Trump policy is typically going to be, full of these extravagant gaps between what's said and what's done. So Trump's rhetoric, for instance, was rather pro-Russia, but that didn't much reflect in his policy as president. So you try to stop him by making him lose a vote, really. That's my answer for now. Our next question comes from Stoneshank Crafting. I'm going to skip the bit of your question about Putin's interference in other countries according to Perun, because I haven't caught that video of Perun's. But I'm going to go to your next question, which is, when trying to validate source check something, I often find I can dig forever. When have you done enough and know you should stop? And when do we know that what we conclude is a fact? It depends on what kind of fact you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about a very basic sort of empirical fact, that's one thing. If by fact you mean something that also entails an interpretation, that's another thing. Like, what does Putin want now? Does Putin want to escalate or de-escalate the war now, right? That's not a fact of the same kind as a fact about how many tanks Russia has left. So, a few comments in no particular order, but I think this requires a separate episode because it's an important question. Understand, if you like, the mission or intentionality behind a platform or a content creator, right? So, for example, you may watch an analytical channel on YouTube about the Russian-Ukrainian war, a channel that takes a pro-Ukrainian position, but it's not in the first instance a pro-Ukrainian channel. Or you might watch the majority of the channels available on YouTube about this that are instrumentalized channels. They are pro-Ukrainian channels and anti-Russian channels, right? And the two might come up with the same analysis most of the time, possibly. But the enterprise there is different. A simply analytical or exploratory channel could easily afford to do 3 episodes in a row criticizing Ukraine, criticizing corruption in Ukraine, criticizing Ukrainian culture or whatever, right? That second kind of channel wouldn't do that. So you've got to understand, and both are completely legitimate ways of operating. It just depends on what one's doing, and it depends on the listener understanding what they're consuming. Second bit. Specifically with the Russian-Ukrainian war, you've got to understand how the Telegram channels work. Most Ukraine commentary on Russia, rather, is based on not understanding what these Telegram channels are doing and who is behind them. And so, many major Western newspapers recycle stuff from these channels without understanding what they are. It often feels like the majority of Twitter commentary on Russia is recycling of these channels by people who don't have the skills to analyze what it is they're recycling, or analyze who is behind them. So, things are taken to be news, often that aren't news, but are in fact specific kinds of attempts to influence the informational environment. It's often not understood what relationship the Kremlin has to these channels, how the Kremlin is using these channels to influence you, and so on. A third point is make a distinction between publications which do need to be fact-checked and publications that don't need to be fact-checked. So I'll give you an example. The Financial Times, if it's making forget about any interpretation it might make, but if it's making a factual claim, is more likely to be right at the moment than The Guardian. And this includes empirical claims in opinion pieces, right? So I would be personally more inclined to fact check something if it's in The Guardian, and less inclined to fact check something if it's in the FT. And you could despise FT's ideology or whatever. You could be a Marxist and think they're terrible. But that's not the point. The point is, are they going to say there are 75 tanks when there are 17 or not? When it comes to, and this is not a knockdown of The Guardian at all. I'm regularly on The Guardian website with great pleasure. But this is a reality. Something else. If it comes to facts like, was the drone a false flag attack, which is not just a matter of empirical facts, unless some further information comes out. It requires interpretation, it requires particular judgments about how Russian politics works and so on. On something like that, just assume everybody you're following doesn't know, and assume that most people you're following cannot know whether they know enough to know, whether they know enough to judge. So in other words, the majority of Western commentary and the majority of YouTube commentary on this false flag attack is just underdetermined. The person making the judgment doesn't have enough grasp of Russian politics for that judgment not just to be fairly arbitrary. So when it comes to things like what's going on in the Putin regime, what is really happening in Russia, even how the Russian economy is doing, unfortunately, assume that nearly all the things you come across are epistemically underpowered, underdetermined. Clearly there are going to be some facts that everybody agrees on. You don't need to worry about them. I mean, there are many facts that Ukraine and Russia agree on, right? So you don't need to worry about those. But we'll have a separate conversation about negotiating the information environment that'll be much more constructive than this brief answer. Marco is asking, what do you think about the term fascist for far-right movements today? I've seen much debate about the accuracy and usefulness of labeling people like Trump and Orban fascists, if you even think they're the same thing. on the one hand, I think we should avoid throwing about terms inaccurately and diluting their meaning. On the other hand, we should use it if it accurately describes a political movement. Now, a key question with fascism is, do you want to go down the route of saying that we're going to have historically and, if you like, politically, scientifically adequate explanations of fascism and nothing else? Or do you go down the route of saying the term is going to be thrown about a lot anyway, so why don't we also have some shorthand every day not definitions, but whatever you want to say instead, for fascism, because it'll make our everyday usage better. And it's naive to expect that the term can just be retired from being used as a kind of political football that's thrown about. So we've got to be careful there. I mean, we do live in a culture with extraordinary cases of concept creep. The hyper-identity politics, culture wars in the West are responsible for eye-watering and very politically harmful concept creep that happens all the time. The term fascism is a term that's suffering a lot of concept creep. A lot of things that are not fascism, almost in any really conception of the term, are called that. Now, there are going to be several serious definitions, right? Definitions in quote marks, nothing that has a history can be defined. You're not going to get a definition of fascism. Somebody offers you one, just ignore it. But you're going to get an account that gives you a sense that is the thing that is. Now, some of these accounts are going to be historical. They're going to capture particular phases of 20th century European history. And that really means that nothing today in that sense should properly be called fascist. But there are also then very important sociological ingredients that can be observed and diagnosed across different historical circumstances and then labeled as fascist, right? So when you're seeing a situation where a leader and the state come to be one, and the leader and the state having come to be one, then begin to come to be one with the people. So that kind of unity of that triad appearing or even appearing on the horizon, should reasonably lead to questions about whether you can diagnose fascism, if not in the historical sense, then in some constructive sense, nevertheless. But then there are also going to be really sort of somewhat trashy everyday accounts thrown about, and we need to figure out which ones are acceptable and which ones are not. And what about something like soft fascism? Is that a term? So I also believe a term like soft fascism is not going to go away, right? And I do think that if it's not going to go away, we've got to get better at using it. So what kinds of ideas should we look at when it comes to these everyday usages of the term, where it's used as a political football and, it needs to be understood what's being talked about. I think there are a couple of images that matter. One image is breaking the democratic game, saying, hey guys, I lost the election, but I don't actually think I should leave. That's one image that's important and helpful here. Another image is when political opponents of the regime begin to shift from being asphyxiated out of the political process to being sort of physically persecuted. So according to that model, if I'm sitting in Budapest and criticizing Mr. Orban, I'm not yet going to be dealing with a fascist regime, because nobody's going to come at 4 o'clock in the morning and take me away and send me to a camp. But I may be muzzled. I may be muzzled because the courts don't work, because the media is controlled. But I'm not going to be taken away in the middle of the night. So what we're looking for is not that the term fascism should have a really good account to itself, but we're rather looking for key political differences, key political shifts that can then be usefully captured. And fascism is one word we could apply to capture them. And so I do think there's a very important shift, right? So you're going to be taken away in the middle of the night in Belarus. You're not going to be taken away in the middle of the night in Hungary. Even if you are, it's going to be an extremely isolated case. And so what happens when you shift from one to the other? I would be okay with saying, yes, we're going fascist here, right? But could you also call Orban an expression of soft fascism, conceivably? Could I approve of that? Yes, I think I would approve of that, because you're talking about breakage of institutions. And that is completely compatible with being much more serious when it comes to giving these sociologically elaborate explanations of fascism and historically elaborate explanations of fascism that are going to go beyond this everyday football game. The only way you're really going to give up on trying to improve these everyday football style definitions is if you say, well, I don't care about them, and I don't care if they keep going, and they will keep going, and I don't care about improving them. Right? So these are some of my thoughts. Next question comes from Christopher, and Christopher is saying, I watched the video by Nicky Proshin, and he presented a very humanized perspective on the reality of isolated acts of protest and civil disobedience in terms of efficacy and consequences. It forced me to question my own possibly dogmatic perspective and question how much would I really do in their position. What would I risk if my opposition was to be manifest rather than simply rhetorical? I'm curious your thoughts on the most effective and pragmatic forms of protest at an individual level. What yields the best result? So it feels like you're asking a question both about Russia but then about the West. About the West, I want to say we'll talk about it later. I have been a very close observer of climate protest movements in the West, actually. And so I have quite a bit to say about that. One of the things that I'm a very big fan of is in the West when protest movements appeal to all citizens. When protest movements don't say this particular group wants that particular result, but when they say this particular result is wanted by that particular group and they should get that result because that group has a right to want that result or some kind of a reasonable claim to wanting that result in virtue of how we understand what is owed to citizens, qua citizens in our country. So I'm very big on how to direct a protest, including street protest, toward appealing to citizen belonging. But we'll talk much, much more about that. In terms of Russia, there are two problems in Russia at the moment with protest. The first is that there are going to be consequences. So what would the consequences be if you protested? Well, roughly it'll be prison. You could get unlucky. It could be a long prison sentence, but the odds are it's not going to be a long prison sentence. But your life on some important dimensions will be very, very difficult. You may lose a prospect of employment. You may lose a prospect of travel. You may harm 5 or 6 people close to you because they might lose employment. They might lose access to their bank account. They might be put on some kind of a list too. So you could be also tortured and physically and sexually abused. That would be common. And that's the first problem. The second problem is, what's that going to achieve, right? You want to feel, and this is back to our conversation about politicization of the Russian public. You want to feel that there's going to be an outcome to this, that is going to be a more than zero chance of change. Because if there is a more than zero chance of change in your perception, you're going to be much more motivated to take risks and even risk your life, right, for an outcome. But the problem in Russia at the moment is that there's this feeling that if we act, nothing will happen. There'll be bad consequences for us, but nothing will. So, and then of course you've got to be realistic and say, well, this is one of those at a collective level thinking it makes it so. If millions of people thought that protesting could have an effect, then that would change how effective protesting is. And then in terms of your idea about what you would do and who would do what, yeah, I mean, it's embarrassing. It's hard to put a number of it, but 90% of the people on the internet who are outraged that people in Russia are not protesting would absolutely not protest and would cry like a baby if even 50% of the consequences that would befall them in that situation befell them. So we've got to be realistic that there's this sort of democratic bias going on. I mean, this is not Extinction Rebellion blocking a road that you're going to be arrested for 48 hours and then you run the risk of basically having problems with some forms of employment maybe, and maybe you run the risk of travel problems. I mean, you're going to be going, from London to New York, and you're going to have to have a criminal record. You're not going to get your visa very easily. So, but this is different. This is very different. You could just disappear overnight, and that's the end of the story in Russia. So some people would protest in that situation, inevitably. But the majority of people with these kinds of consequences would not act. That's the reality. David is asking, I wonder what your take is on the Russian psyche. I've often wanted to see a collation, rumination, the formative elements of the Russian people. And this might go a long way in helping to understand why apparently neither you nor I were at all surprised at the current pleasure at human suffering that is evidenced today. So I do think there's an important element to this business of pleasure in evil and pleasure in suffering. I even think the Z symbol has come to some extent to stand for the joy of being bad. So it's not just sort of delusion and various kinds of destructiveness that are free from things like sadism and other dispositions, neighboring dispositions are a part of this. It's very important to understand that this is not just negative destructiveness, this is positive destructiveness too. Obviously, I mean, you're asking for a sort of a charisma, care, like collage of influences on where Russia is now psychosocially. So I'm only going to say one thing. It's almost impossible to underestimate the destruction, psychological destruction caused by the 1917 revolution. You genuinely get a different country. There's an extraordinary discontinuity between Russia before and Russia after. Sometimes that's missed because, folks on the wrong end of imperialism say that they were bad before, they're bad after, they're bad again. So the communist period doesn't stand out, and Mr. Putin comes in and says the same thing. The communist period doesn't stand out, just another incarnation of Russian imperialism. But things got very, 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 very sick. I mean, this is like a country being taken over by ISIS. Right? This is misrepresenting and exaggerating, but we're placing a marker to give us an indication of where we should look. So very, very extreme stuff, and that combined with an extraordinary lack of processing of it, right, is where Russia is. And I sometimes say that Mr. Putin has been a kind of a negative therapist for Russia. It's not just lack of processing of this stuff, it's actually intensifying it via going to some kind of a demonic therapist. That's worse than no therapist at all. We're going to say much more on this in the future, actually, but that communist experiment is a psychological catastrophe for that country. The next question comes from Denis, and Denis saying, I'm trying to understand the mindset of Russians, officers, pilots, weapons experts who are responsible for attacks on civilians, and people get blown out of their apartments. Trying to understand how they justify their actions. Is it just blind obedience? Greetings from Berlin. Not sure if you'll answer this. I wanted to get this off my chest. Well, let's go back to the Nazi thing we said earlier, whereby it's important to keep our process of making sense of something open-ended. So I'm not going to answer you directly, but let's try to put a few things on the table. One of them is going to be a distinction between positive destructive energies, if you like, negative capacity, and then something else that's not that. So always leave room for positive destructiveness, right? That's a big part of human capability always, and don't leave it out. Obedience and the banality of that obedience is important. I'd also look at how particular institutions work, how the Russian military works. I'd look at the special kind of fatalism of Russian culture and the special kind of resignation to what hierarchy in Russian culture. Obviously, the people bombing apartments aren't the soldiers on the ground who've been conscripted. These people are often there for mixed motives, and they're kind of an expression of the desolation of life in small Russian towns. There's also going to be just some hawkish belief about how Ukraine is in fact NATO in disguise and it's an existential threat to Russia. So my advice is always try to explain, right, instead of demonizing. Don't run out of steam and say monsters, monsters. try to get inside people's heads. Look at specific cultural pathologies that are maybe particular to Russia. Look at particular institutional pathologies and distinguish between destructiveness as a byproduct of other things, a byproduct of banality, illusion, good intent, and an expression of something more positively destructive. So, that's some of it. And this is the end. Comment. Some of the questions have come from Patreon. Patreon is a platform, given some of the health stuff I mentioned earlier, that over the next years, I'm going to need to probably quintuple to create the kind of sustainability so that this conversation continues and grows. And what I'm really aiming at, fundamentally, is over years working toward a situation where my focus is you in the end, and everything else falls by the side, so that I'm not doing the different things to make this possible. I'm doing this with an infrastructure around me, helping me to tick over with all the other things, from editing to various kinds of banal bureaucracy. Moreover, it's very significant for me to not just develop my philosophical work and bring it into the world, but emphasize that it's not discontinuous from the public conversation we're having here, actually. So that has a very special importance, and it's therefore significant that can develop too in parallel. So sustainability is an important thing, and I'm very grateful for the journey I'm taking on that platform, Patreon. It still has a very, very long way to go, but it's a journey toward the sustainability of a conversation that I regard as a lifelong thing. I intend to keep you for life. Whichever one of us lives long, I'm going to try to do my best with my health to be around, so that we can keep telling truthful and hopeful stories about the world. Lots of love. Talk soon.